everybody. It is Mike Levin on August 19th, 2021. And I just dropped off my daughter, and I'll be picking her up tomorrow. And I have so much to talk about, and at the same time, so little to talk about. I make these videos typically when I have things I really need to work through and stuff isn't really just clicking and I need to do a little exploratory out loud thinking, talking to oneself, but sharing it with the world because YouTube, why not? However, things are going fairly well. I'm at a little bit of a lull in work. That's because of calm before the storm issues, and I am symbolically sharpening my saw, working on a number of different technologies that work together, very much trying to adhere to the Linux model, or it's really the Unix model, of how short commands with a lot of variable input arguments or parameters can, receive input and then pipe their output to the next program and so on down the chain. I found that over the years that no matter what your tool set in tech, that Linux style piping chain, Unix style piping chain, is highly effective. It keeps parts interchangeable. It keeps parts small enough to be interchanged. You can gradually drift things into more modern states over the years and have a lot of reusable components without marrying yourself to any particular technology or platform. And just on those issues alone, I could probably do a 1 hour talking video, except it's all going right well. It's all going very well. The new twist on it is that some of these components now are formal Python.py packages released into the Python packaging index and all, PyPy, PyPI, but are created in Jupyter Notebook, technically Jupyter Lab, which I've full-time shifted over to, using the NBDev tool, which is a set of little command line tools mostly that makes working in Jupyter to create Python packages to work in a more developer method much easier, much more friendly. Now, I am very much on the vibrating edge between these two worlds, trying to keep keenly aware of the world on one side that consists of JavaScript, Visual VS Code, they're calling it these days, Node.js, web development in general, user interface and user experience issues, UI, UX, and that's all on one side. It's a very sexy side. There's a lot of money to be made there. There's a lot of jobs to be had, but there's a lot of platform churn and volatility. And as a 50-year-old guy who's been through this a zillion times, I just don't get infatuated by the next JavaScript library the way all the young people are, who are flocking from, Angular to React to Vue, and now there's even other ones that are on the horizon that compile to normal JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, without the special runtime engines that are typically required for things such as React. Svelte, I think, it might be one of them. But while I follow them, I am not really drawn to them because it's fire in motion, as Joel Spolsky puts it. As soon as you invest your 10 years and 10,000 hours to get really good at something, everything's changed to force you on to the next platform, the next developer tools, and generally to spend more money with vendors. It's maybe a little bit less like that in the JavaScript world because, free and open source, Chromium, Node.js. However, for whatever reason, probably the youngness of the web platform still, there's a lot more churn than a long in the tooth, pragmatic person like me really wants to take on. It's a young person's game for those early phases when you'll go to almost any lengths to, do miraculous work. At my age, you want to do miraculous work as a function of your muscle memory, of your deeply ingrained, static set of muscle skills and knowledge and know-how. Now, of course, nothing is ever static, or if it is, it goes bad, you'd be dead in a few years. So you always have to remain a little bit dynamic and open, and it's a question of degree. I talk again about that vibrating edge. So I like to live at the vibrating edge, where the next things I'm really excited about learning and taking up are, say, Python's new pattern matching in version 3.9, alternative packages that use the pandas-like API. It's just a delight to see things like Xarray and other packages for manipulating data following the pandas package, the seminal, the formative pandas package for handling row and column data or SQL table-like data in memory in Python, to see other related libraries come along that have the same data frame concepts, the same loc and iloc, which is the location in memory of areas in a data grid, and the by name, which is loc, and by index, which is iloc, I-L-O-C. And so these things are appearing in other packages so that your knowledge and know-how seamlessly transitions over from package to package. So if pandas were to one day go obsolete by, say, a concurrent version of pandas, because right now it's CPU bound because it sits on NumPy, which is compiled in C for your particular hardware, which, to keep it optimal, the irony is, for the fastest speed, you actually give up concurrency in that case. And there's ways around it, which leads to other things I'm excited about. The Dask package is a way to do concurrent programming where you only ever really think about it in the non-concurrent way, synchronous and asynchronous. So thinking in asynchronous style is hard for me. It's an obstacle that I have rarely overcome. In fact, I hit lots of obstacles I rarely overcome. I seem to non-technical people like some real sort of technical wizard, but in all honesty, I'm much more like the non-technical people, where I only have so much room in my head for, complexity and fancy mental acrobatics. Things like differential equations and stuff really stop me. And so too has Java. Java has stopped me. And for those who are not really into it, JavaScript is not Java. Java is much more like C. And C has stopped me as well because of all the record keeping that has to be done. Java reduces a lot of that record keeping with garbage collection, the heap and the stack. You don't have to think about as much in Java. But nonetheless, the syntax and the way you instantiate, classes with public static void and all that stuff, there's just so much overhead, so many little curly cues and extra bits that you have to, that are seemingly arbitrary, that you have to keep pinpoint precision track of, or else your code doesn't run. You create memory leaks. And as opposed to that is Python, where things are much, much more simple. I want to use fancy words around it, but Python is much more simple than both Java and JavaScript, simpler certainly than C, simpler than most languages, because it quite literally, one of the appropriate places for the word literally, has less curly cues. It has less edges. Defining blocks of code uses indents, which everyone does anyway in their code for readability. So if you're going to do it anyway, why not give it meaning? And you can follow your code indentation to find your bugs instead of following curly cue brackets. I could go on forever, but there's a bunch of little things that at the end of the day come off like dogma, like religion, like static thinking stuff. This is what I've decided to think, and now people can't change my mind because I know this is the one true best way. There's a lot of that in Python. However, you can't let yourself be ruled by it, because even when I talk about my developer and runtime stack, Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, guess what? Python don't come first, Linux does. And the Unix way of using command line commands chained up so that they can pipe to each other or output to external text files or be used in a script, which is where the concept of scripting language comes from, is more fundamentally powerful than all the stuff I love about Python. So Unix/Linux comes first. If there wasn't Linux, I would probably be on FreeBSD, which seems to be perfectly fine, except the Linux world is more dynamic. So what's the difference between Linux and Unix? Well, Linux has zillions of repos, of redistributions, respins, different philosophies infused into them. The big split is between Debian-style Unix, which the immensely popular Ubuntu is based on, and which Microsoft has adopted, versus the IBM-style Linux, which is Red Hat, Mandrake, CentOS, and a lot more enterprise corporate. And it's funny that Microsoft went the non-enterprise corporate way, but that's probably because IBM was already partnered with the Red Hat camp. So Microsoft went to the other logical camp, which is Ubuntu, which is Debian, which is the original repository that worked out your dependency chains well. That was its claim to fame back in the day. Now, of course, it works that way on the Red Hat side as well through all the RPM and Yum stuff. However, they have different traditions, different lineages, the branch splits between Debian and Red Hat. The branch also splits on this third one, which is called Arch Linux, and a handful of others under that category, like Pacman, that's Arch's repo system, Pacman. But Gentoo, or Gentoo, depending on your pronunciation, is another one where there's a lot of compiling from scratch. And those folks have gone sort of bad boy alternative routes, which is much, much smaller distributions that could fit on, single floppy drives. Arch and Gentoo Linux are great for embedded systems because it strips out all that stuff that makes it work a lot more like generic desktop systems. So many little directions, so many rabbit holes of this discussion I could go down. Red Hat and Debian have both evolved to be friendly for desktop Linux, things that compete with Microsoft and Macintosh as your whole desktop system. But if you don't care about a desktop and you're only logging in externally, the world opens up into even more options that strip out a lot of the crap and the cruft, which it's called in computer science terms. Cruft is unnecessary software and surface area and potential hackability that's always just sitting there because everyone wants that one more thing in the Linux distro that doesn't need to be there, but because these organizations yield to demands over time, even Debian and Red Hat derivatives get incredibly bloated. Non-bloated versions get spun off as different distros. More user-friendly versions like Mint get spun off as different distros, and that's the Linux world. You just keep spinning off different custom distros that suit your own purposes. However, in the Unix world, it's more of a authority-driven ivory tower, let us say, centralized authority, official version world, because it comes from, the B in BSD comes from Berkeley System Distro. And that was a stolen version when Ken Thompson, the inventor of Unix, used to take trips from Bell Labs, AT&T's Bell Labs. It wasn't AT&T then, but Ma Bell, one of the big phone companies, over to, Berkeley, the university, University in California, for their computer society stuff. Might have been his alma mater, I'm not exactly sure, but he brought with him his work from the halls of Bell Lab, and that became the first BSD, Berkeley System Distro, which was stolen from Bell Labs, and that became the whole SCO lawsuit thing, a great big entanglement. And while that was going on, all the things that were legally encumbered in BSD got broken out, and part of now FreeBSD. And FreeBSD is, still official, still ivory tower-ish, but if you want a Mint desktop on it, you can get it. So these worlds of, loosey-goosey Linux and pure Unix are being blended together because it can be done now, because whatever your poison, someone will mix it for you. So FreeBSD with a pretty desktop, with a robust software repository system, so you can install Unix software just like you can install Linux software. And so as of now, there's really not much difference between Unix and Linux from a functional, carpentry standpoint. Walrus and the Carpenter. The Carpenter takes up tools. One of the tool choices you'll need to make is Unix versus Linux. Well, when you learn how to use those tools, when you learn one, you mostly learn the other. So the point is moot. These days, I would take up the Debian branch just because Microsoft is pushing it, and so much resources is going to go behind making sure it's friendly, it's stable, and all those advancements are contributed back into the free and open source community and can trickle down into the core Debian distro from which everything else is derived. So first derivatives have innovation, and then those innovations are borrowed and stolen back down into the more core parts that it's built up from. That happened when Apple solved all its operating system scheduling and task launching issues, because when Apple switched, I believe it was OS 9, their proprietary Macintosh operating system, open to a more free and open source based one when they switched it from OS 9 to OS X. That X replaced the old proprietary stuff that started on Motorola 68000s and then was ported to Power PCs. At some point, they made that shift over to the Intel platform, and in for a penny, in for a pound. Why not go for broke? Shifting machine hardware architecture? Oh, let's shift the whole underlying software architecture too. And so they created their own distro from the Berkeley branch, and they called it Darwin, the evolution of Berkeley system distro. And that's why to this day our iPhones are based on a boot up kernel that's more from the Berkeley, I think they call it Mach lineage, than it is from the Red Hat lineage. There's some splits going on there. But Apple took up the Berkeley Linux and evolved it into Darwin, and innovations that are made in Darwin now trickle back into and across into Linux. So what innovation? So it's Systemd. I talk a lot about Systemd. It wasn't called Systemd on the Apple side, it was something else, I don't know what. But the way it addresses being able to launch services, Linux daemons we call them on the Linux side, and how to check and make sure they're running and relaunch them if they're not running, and then how to schedule things to pop up and run, replacing what a lot of people call cron jobs. If you're still doing cron jobs, you're living in the old archaic world. No matter how you try to improve that API, it's never going to be as good as daemons under System D. So if you're on Gen 2 or Arch Linux, you don't have System D. Those are things that, are on the main big popular branches of Red Hat and Debian, but it didn't make it to Gen 2 and Arch. So System D, even within the Linux world, is not universal, nor is it a true Linux innovation, but more so a borrowed Apple innovation. So when you decide, what you're doing tech-wise, there's so many different tools to look at and to consider taking up. So when I say Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, I'm not just talking about Linux, Bash, the type-in user interface, which I am talking about, but not only that, and not just the popular commands like ls to list the files, and cd to change your directory, and cp for copy, and I think mkdir for make dir. There's a handful of those you just really need to know and use and be able to get around. Not only those, but I am also talking about System D, because if you can't start something running on the time a system boots, and if you can't make sure it's running, and if you can't schedule things to run, you're not the master of that hardware. You can't be a data master, you can't be a sysadmin, a DevOps person, you fill in the blank, whatever you want to call it. If you can't step in and take control of what that hardware is doing early in its boot sequence, when the kernel gets the hardware running, real low-level kernel stuff, not even built in. There's even lower-level stuff when back in the day we called it the NBR, the master boot record. And even lower level than that is a place in the hardware that tells a system where to look for its master boot record. And a master boot record is less than an old-fashioned floppy disk worth of data. It gets written in to start the boot process and to hand it off to a next level operating system. This day and age on the Linux side, which I know best, it's initfs. It's the initialization of your system, initialization of your file system, which lives in RAM, is about a 512, I got to figure, Mike, K or meg. It's probably 512 megabytes, I would imagine, half a gigabyte these days. It sounds big to me for this purpose. It might even be 512K. I gotta look and remind myself. It's certainly on the K side, the thousands of kilobytes in distros like BusyBox. So all this stuff I'm talking about, there's even stripped down tinier versions that gives you just the Linux you need to boot, because you're working on some system, it's proprietary through and through, except for the boot process, which is Linux. There's a Linux kernel. So if you have a Linux kernel that gets the hardware powered up and starts loading things into memory and starts executing, usually at that time proprietary code, and you want it to be less proprietary, and you want your old familiar CD and LS, operating system, DOS-style commands, you boot into BusyBox on that system. You go, master boot record, point to BusyBox. Now I've got, a 1 megabyte Linux system, more typically 10 megabytes these days, but you can get it in one where you can look in, poke around, take control of things, and change the boot scripts and change what it does. So you need that level of carpentry skills when you're going the generic tech route. Web development isn't a generic tech route. Web development is a very particular spin, flavor, platform rife with nuances that represents a snapshot in time that will never exactly be called upon to be used the same way as it is today. 5 or 10 years from now, you will not be using the React library like you do today. You will not be using the Vue library, and you will not even be using the Svelte library like you are today. Everything you are learning, knowing, and doing, committing to muscle memory, will be obsolete. Linux bash scripts won't be. That'll last you for the it's lasted for the last 40 years, it'll last for the next 40 years. At least one human lifetime end to end. And of course it will overlap with other similar stuff, which it will be easy to transition to. They tried to obsolete all this Unix/Linux stuff, and it even came from the same Bell Labs that Unix came from. It's called, see if I can get it right, I think it's called Bell 9. It might be called Bell 9 for Bell Labs, and it might be like 9th iteration of them doing this type of stuff. But the same purism people who, it's not really purism, I gotta take that back. It's kind of a pragmatic purism that made Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie thumb their nose at the megalithic corporate endeavor that was going on at the time called Multics. And as a double entendre language joke, wordplay, they called their version Unix. They took Multics, which was a time-sharing, very corporate, General Electric, AT&T, Honeywell. There was a lot of corporate backing behind this, and it was, planned to be the guaranteed success by corporate America, and it most certainly would have killed the internet if it became successful. But instead, two people did a skunkworks project and created Unix. Had its balls chopped off, had tons of bugs, but it was small, easy to learn, had a certain sort of cadence or rhythm to it that once you got it down, you could incredibly easily hop from hardware to hardware. See, platform gets a little ambiguous because platform is adding together your hardware, your software, your network stuff, and your development platform. Like, platform now is like Nintendo. Every Nintendo piece of hardware, every Nintendo game is its whole entire platform. When you learn exclusively to develop for one platform, you are very much keyed in and narrowed down and sort of a slave to the platform and the vendor. And if the platform changes or goes away, so too does your viability in the marketplace. So there are pseudo platforms, para platforms, types of platforms that are just not like that. And one of them is the Linux generic command line platform. When you can terminal into, it used to be called teletyping, standing for TTY, which was, teletypewriting, which existed even back, almost before computers. It was high-end Morse code, so you could send words by typing in a typewriter rather than tapping it out, and that was TTY, teletype. My dad used to use it to communicate with the Far East, overseas, in the textile business. Everyone should read Outliers. My dad was one of those New York textile Jews for whom the industry dried up, but he was using TTY. He told me about it. He told me how the tricks were to abbreviate how you were saying stuff, which is a lot of where that short syntax came from. And I was born just miles from the Bell Labs where Unix was invented. My dad was in the New York textile industry using TTY, on which the Unix terminal was based. And I'm 50 years old. It's taken me all this time to sort of connect the dots and to piece together how close to the heart of all this action I really was. And of course, most of this action moved from the New York, New Jersey, Princeton area over to the West Coast, the Golden Gate, all that new wealth and wanted to invest in stuff, and it was a great place to live. So all the developers were like, oh, I'll live out there and take your money and smoke your weed. And most things happened in the West Coast during the dot-com boom of the late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of it's coming back because of the New York media, but now, with lockdown, even that's changing it. Where are the people who can pay the money and the corporate financial investors was New York City and Broadway and culture. So a lot of that West Coast stuff started coming back to the East Coast, and it was a lot of equalization. And I'm like, yay. That's about when I moved out to New York City, became a vice president of a public relations firm, made a keyword suggestion tool for the early days of SEO, did it for hire, kind of got screwed, so walked away from that, and have been kind of wandering around ever since, going, where should I hang my hat? And I am the ultimate simp, being fooled over and over. First taking up the Amiga computer because it was cool. It was the future now, back in the late 80s. Multitasking, smooth animation, the equivalent of the web in all its free and open source software, which they called public domain software back in those days, being distributed over FidoNet and other systems, which used normal dial-up telephone, to the local bulletin boards like Joe Malika's Millennium Falcon, that he ran out of a apartment that was just near where my mom lived at the time, near the Philadelphia Art Museums. And Commodore, the computer company who bought the Amiga off of the Atari engineers, the rebel Atari engineers who broke off to start their own, computer/game company, ran out of money, wanted to sell it to Atari, but in a bidding war between Atari and Commodore, Atari stopped bidding, and Commodore screwed them down to like almost nothing. And that's the story of how Commodore got the Amiga computer, which was more in the Atari, the old home video game that launched the industry. We called it the Atari 2600 here in the United States. A lot of the world knows it as the VCS. It was even inferior to other things at the time, but the pricing was right, the games were right. It was a good platform, although a little quirky, but then all that lineage of quirkiness led to the Amiga that I love so much. And it was a real secret weapon when I was around 18 years old, and I drank that Kool-Aid, drank it all in, and then I found out the Kool-Aid was poisoned because planar versus chunky graphics, bit planes, that gave Amiga a lot of its awesomeness, and preemptive multitasking that gave the Amiga a lot of its awesomeness, and highly custom chip designs, which gave a lot of the Amiga its awesomeness, meant that everything was highly coupled between software and platform. Platform went away, knowledge and know-how, like years of it went away. Truly a heartbreak. Paul Calkin and Jesse, some of my Unix mentors at Commodore, would laugh at the situation, saying, yeah, the Amiga's more the Amiga in name, because it was a lot of people's girlfriends back in those days, let me tell you, with those graphics capabilities and everything. And I suppose I was no different, but when it went away and the heart was broken, that was a giant fool me once, but I was already on the Coleco Atom platform before that, so I was up to fool me twice. I switched to the Microsoft platform at the time, which at the time was active server page, all those .asp files that are still out there all over the net from a web perspective. Along with that came Microsoft Windows itself, starting out on 3.1, but we went through that whole, going to Windows 95, and then Millennium, and then finally the stabilization of it all on whatever we have today. I guess it's Windows 10. It took a while to get there, but there was a lot of flaky stuff in between. Vista. Oh, it stabilized on Windows 2000 server stuff. It was on the server side that it stabilized it. Windows NT and Server 2000 is where it all kind of stabilized. And the best of that tradition was then lifted and I guess turned into Windows 10. I might be a little fuzzy on this, but such platform churn that even though they made it work, there was tons of duck and fire, retrain, repay, retrain, repay, retrain, repay. And it's just an inefficient way to interact with tools. It's an unhealthy relationship with tools. Microsoft in general promotes an unhealthy relationship with your development tool set. And when I say your development tool set, it's just your language. It's what you speak. It's your equivalent to your tech version of English or whatever your spoken language is. And you have a right to internalize it, to take it inside of you, to get better at it over time, to get more eloquent, to get fancier tricks, to develop secret weapons based on it, and to not have the carpet pulled out from under you every 5 to 10 years. And I'm 50, so I've had the carpet pulled out from under me fully 5 times. I've been fooled at least 5 times, and I do believe I'm done with that. The latest thing everyone's being fooled by is the JavaScript framework rat race. And I am avoiding web development over really that purpose until the web API stabilizes. It's not stable. If the first thing you have to do is take up a framework to make vanilla JavaScript usable, even for things like maintaining state, then you chose the wrong language. So over the years, I've been through so many languages. TCL was appealing, something called Scopus in the, user, what do they call, customer relationship, quality support, tech support world. They had this product called Scopus. They use TCL as its embedded language, and you'll find these embedded languages all over the place. They're like free and open source, usually quite small languages that fit in your head, that are borrowed and embedded into other systems so that they can have a development platform for those more proprietary systems. Scopus was one, and in the whole gobbling up stuff, I think it became part of Epicor. I forget exactly what, but other embedded languages you might encounter include Lua, L-U-A, and even Lisp. Lisp is an embedded language, or dialects of Lisp, such as Scheme, which you'll encounter, are embedded into a lot of products. Python has become, and the qualifications for being embedded are usually small, relatively stable, and of course free and open source, because you're not going to embed something that you have to pay licensing fees on. So Lua, TCL, Scheme, Lisp Scheme, you'll find embedded into things like Inkscape and Blender, free and open source software, embedding free and open source languages to give them APIs. Python is being used more and more for that stuff, and of course Blender, and I do think Inkscape, which is kind of a vector graphics. We're talking about vector graphics, and we're talking about 3D graphics, not computer-aided design in particular. I think that's something of a whole still in the free and open source world. I might be wrong by now with all the 3D printing out there. But in the free and open source world that competes with Adobe, namely Adobe, was there vector graphics? It's been such a long time, I forget it now, right? It's not freehand, it's freehand versus Adobe Illustrator. The free and open source Illustrator is basically Inkscape, and I think they've embedded Python as their programmable API language. So if you want to draw spirographs, take up Inkscape and program it in Python. Or if you want to take up 3D graphics to compete with, Maya, the stuff that makes the Disney Pixar type movies, that would be Blender as your choice in the free and open source world. It started out in the proprietary world, and because it couldn't compete with, I guess, 3D Max and the things of its like at the time, they contributed the entire Blender code base into the free and open source world. And that's being used for full-length movies these days. And the embedded language in that is Python. So again, superpowers arise from learning Python because the runtime engines, the place where you can apply and use it, varies from everything from like 1 megabyte, embedded systems. Of course, Python will make it more than a megabyte. But what it sits on could be BusyBox, and then an additional 20 megabytes for an old version of 2.7 Python. You know, for under 30 megabytes, you've got a platform, the types of platforms that you could put on drones that are maybe memory constrained and processor constrained, or you could program Disney graphics type stuff. You could do financial programming because, you know, all the financial software, more the kind of stuff I use. The Pandas library, which was created for manipulating Excel and SQL row and column type data, which is where a lot of this discussion occurred. And then one of the big criticisms of Python, I say, get away from platform volatility. If the first thing you do is have to choose your framework for your platform, like choosing a JavaScript web framework, you've chosen the wrong platform. And so there is no real great web platform right now. You know, the closest thing might be Svelte, because it compiles to vanilla JavaScript, even though it gives you all those things you need, like statefulness. And then you can go over to pure JavaScript, which is all that's really built into the web platform, because it's all that's really built into Node and the whatever they're calling the V8 JavaScript engine these days, and Chrome and Firefox and the browsers. But in Python is a framework. Yet there are zillions of frameworks under Python, and the first thing people do is choose which one to take up. Why is that? Well, first, you don't need a framework on Python the same way you do on JavaScript. It's a matter of degrees, okay? It's not a matter of, you know, Python's just as bad as JavaScript, because to do web development, you've got to take up Flask, or something like it, pylons. There's so many. It's only to give it routing. Stuff called routing is not built into core standard library, because Python does not include everything. Battery's not included. So when you get to specialized areas, you've got to still pip install stuff. However, it is still a framework in its own right, and you really have to look at Python to understand why it is a framework. It starts with its data types and its execution models, and list tuples and dictionaries being available as primitives starts the story of Python itself being a framework. So when you want to do the row and column Excel SQL type stuff, the first thing you do is you take up a framework. You take up Pandas, the Pandas package. And Pandas is built on NumPy, which is another package. So you're taking up two packages. And it gives you higher level stuff in the same way you have to take up a JavaScript framework to get higher level web development stuff. You have to take up a Python framework to get higher level row and column Excel-like data type primitives. And that's why I pay so much attention to other packages that come out that deal in similar problems as Pandas. If those packages start using the same APIs as Pandas does, then the difference between Python frameworks, because of similar APIs, is less big of a difference than the difference between JavaScript frameworks. Go from Angular, Google's AngularJS, to Facebook's React.js, for example, and your religion changes, your philosophies, your underlying tenets and principles change, and there's a lot of relearning and a lot of retraining. It's not easy to go from Angular to React. It's a lot easier to go from React to Vue, so sometimes JavaScript does have the similar APIs, but there's these huge philosophy shifts as you go from framework to framework. And as long as you want your websites to continue look, behave, and feeling like React, then you stay on React like frameworks, and your stuff just gets marginally easier. You get a few more benefits, more or different bells and whistles thrown in, like switching from React to Vue. That is not really good enough for me. I want to switch from row and column, tabular data, matrix type stuff, to ragged arrays, okay? And when you do that, you switch from pandas to Xarray. Xarray has similar APIs to pandas. And so goes the tradition now of sticking, which comes from slices, which comes where they're all riffing on each other. Things in pandas riffs on things from the standard library, right? Things in the standard library were invented mostly by Guido van Rossum or the ABC language people before him, on which Python was a riff. So Python is a riff on the ABC language. All of this came out of Denmark, I believe. So the Danish people have, the Dutch people, is it Dutch? I think so, I gotta get all this straight, have a real talent for simple APIs that really hide the complexity and only expose it when you need it. If you want a taste for that, go to any Python environment and execute import this, import space this, and you'll get the kind of mantra of Python and why this kind of thinking permeates from the standard library on up. So Guido van Rossum and the standard library riffed on the ABC language. Packages like pandas riff on the standard library. They derive from, they use similar techniques too. And then packages like Xarray riff on pandas, and so on down the chain. And so the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me thing, which I'm really bad at. The definition of stupidity is if you keep repeating the same mistakes, and boy, do I. So by the time I was 40, the story of my life, right? Baby was coming along, I was married, I was resettled in New York, and I realized that the kind of energy I threw into things to be as good as computer science people who seemed to be able to take up things and internalize them quicker and know them better. I never was able to compete with people who could just go, oh yeah, this is how you do it in Java, or this is how you do it in C. And the compiling process really had a lot to do with that. There's a certain thing about static typing your variables and compiling it and then having a compilable that stays in place for a long time versus the more rapid iterative process, which is associated with scripting files and interpreters versus non-script languages and the compiling process. Now, truly, the line has been blurred, and the shell game has almost erased the difference between these two worlds now. And scripting languages functionally have all the same advantages as compiled languages. If you wanted to statically type all your Python variables and compile your code, you could. You would use a different PyPy instead of PyPI for the Python packaging index. PyPy, so when you do pip install, that's where that comes from. You would rather use PyPy, which is an alternative runtime engine for Python. There's the C, or standard, or specification runtime engine, the one which really comes from originally Guido van Rossum and now the Python organization, the Python Foundation, python.exe to most people out there. But that's only one of many, many possible execution environments or executables or interpreters or, compiled runners that you can use for Python, because the line is completely blurred. As a free and open source language, a very lightly encumbered one, I think it's just the GNU, general license, the GNU general license 2, perhaps. There's a 2 and a 3. They're very popular. There's a few different licenses out there. Some force you to volunteer back your contributions, and others don't. Well, anyway, I digress an awful lot. Python gets changed a lot because of the liberal licensing, changed into a compiled platform, changed into a tiny embedded platform. to a REPL read eval print learning platform like in Jupyter Notebook, and it gets twisted and changed, and it's not always the original code that came from Guido and the Python Foundation. Sometimes it's a complete re-implementation of the Python interpreter, Python engine, let's call it that. That way we don't get hung up on whether it's interpreted or compiled. And the APIs of the things you use is consistent across all these platforms. What isn't consistent is whether you have compiled packages like NumPy. It's very common to say, hey, I'm using embedded Linux, I'm using embedded Linux, and I'm thus using embedded Python or tiny Python or one of the small versions. I want to pip install NumPy, and you can't. Those platform differences come into play there on the different Python engines. So, pip install is a python.exe or specification CPython standard. You can pip install when you're using, things that either directly are that. So if you go to the Microsoft command window, you just type Python, it's going to bring you to the Microsoft store. You allow the Microsoft store to install Python, you get CPython as derived, as altered a little bit by Microsoft so that it lives well on their platform. If you go to python.org and you download the Microsoft installer or the .exe and you install it, you also get CPython, but without the Microsoft Store overhead that steps in and tries to update things automatically and create sandboxes and protect your memory and stuff. If you go to Anaconda and you download the Anaconda install so that you get Jupyter Notebook through your browser, you also get CPython, python.exe. But a slightly older version because the Anaconda organization has to keep changing it and updating it in their Anaconda distribution. So even when you stay to the standard CPython specification implementation, you get slightly different ones based on how and where you install it. But they're all still CPython, and pip install will continue to work. Even though Anaconda added their own version, Conda install. Much less necessary now that pip has been upgraded with the wheel system so that executables for different platforms can be dropped right onto your particular hardware. Executables that have been pre-compiled and optimized for your hardware. So important now with the 64-bit ARM hardware in both the Apple world as they re-platform again, taking themselves off of Intel and put themselves onto ARM hardware because they're big investors in ARM. You might not know this, but the Commodore of the UK, a company called Acorn, had decided to create their own processors because what was out at the time was not good enough. And what they created long outlived their Acorn company, and it became the ARM platform, and it became technology licensing rather than a particular processor. So whereas Intel always manufactured and fabricated their own hardware and you would buy an Intel processor, not so much anymore as they start to license that work or farm that work out to Taiwanese companies because they got down to 5 nanometers where Intel didn't. So the world keeps changing. There ain't nothing that you can take for granted. But as Apple re-platforms onto 64-bit ARM of their own design, using ARM licenses, as probably the largest ARM licensor, or licensee as probably the largest ARM licensee, with ARM themselves being the licensor. Microsoft is doing the same thing as their new Surface lines are the first in what's bound to be a new wave of ARM-based Windows products that really blurs the line, because unlike older versions that tried to do that with Windows, I believe it's RT, that could only run software that was specially compiled and feature stripped out and basically, castrated versions of their software on on their old ARM platforms, on their old ARM Surface platforms. Their new ARM Surface platforms completely blurs the line with the same shell game that Apple did with virtual machines and stuff to make Intel-style software run on ARM-style hardware. So the hardware replatforming is the ultimate shell game. So you can bet that the hardware manufacturers don't want to be screwed over and over with a fool me once, fool me twice, won't get fooled again stuff that they are doing to their very users. Can you see the deep unfairness of this? Apple and Microsoft, among every other company who's in this business, is trying to decouple their software from the processors so they can source their processors from anywhere and get all the new benefits of mobile innovations and lower power consumption of mobile and, keyboardless use with touchscreens, and to get all the things that have been innovated in mobile over the years up through the ARM lineage path. On the desktop and laptop type platforms, they want all that for free. So they're putting a lot of work into translation layers, a lot of machine interpretation layers that we would call virtual machines. But their platforms, their development platforms that they offer up to their users, keeps having you to have to relearn things, to retrain, to go through certification over and over again, to keep paying for upgrades. And it's intensely and deeply unfair. And to someone like me, who only has the capacity to learn very little and to make their static core a forever improving muscle memory thing, right? You see, I want my tech to be like martial arts. You don't have to relearn martial arts every few years. You have to practice your martial arts to keep in shape. You go through your kata, you do your sparring. So sparring is the same as Jupyter Notebook, runtime, read eval print loops. Sparring is ad hoc work, new problems every time, getting in the ring and duking it out with different problems, different opponents every time. That's sparring in martial arts, and you should be good at sparring. There's sparring in tournaments, but in tournaments, it's not only sparring that you can compete in and get judged on and get better, it's also form. The forms are called kata. Kata is not fighting an opponent, but really just going through the moves. And my wife, Natalie, is now in karate. She's in the karate that came from, that Karate Kid came from, Japanese hard soft karate. I got to learn a little more about it. I myself came up through the Taekwondo route, the very, I guess it's Korean and Americanized karate that's taught to soldiers. Punch with a fist, bash with a foot, really straightforward American stuff. She's learning Japanese karate, which is hard soft, which is maybe a little more nuanced, bringing in a little bit more of the soft stuff. And it was founded by the same guy that I forget the name, but Arnold, for the mentor in the first Karate Kid movie. That guy was modeled on the founder of this Japanese karate. That's the karate my wife is in, and she's getting up to her first kata, so it's very much on my mind. And in katas and form, you fight imaginary opponents. You go through a prescribed combination of moves. You see which moves work well together, and it becomes second nature muscle memory, and eventually your kata form starts to leak into your sparring, and you get better at sparring because of your form. You get better at your form because of your sparring. And that's martial arts, and that has a certain satisfaction in it of getting forever better at your core set of tools, which is similar to carpentry. I talk about it all the time. It's in every industry. There's the classics, right? Musicians have classic forms of musical instruments, which might change experimentally over the years, but really there's the basic violins and guitars and saxophones and trombones, and that you can keep going back to, that if you pick up another of the same type, you'll be able to play it. your muscle memory carries over. You can never be made obsolete. Of course, the same exists in carpentry, where you fill your toolbox with the hammers and the saws, and you keep your saws sharp and your blades sharp. So there's a lot of sharpening of the blade metaphors. Your practice comes in actually using the tools, using it for yourself. Side projects, working on your home. You know, how many contractors do you know who take great joy in building out their home castle? I lived on Staten Island for a while, and I'll tell you, those contractors like to build their own castles. It's an island full of contractor castles, carpenters practicing their trade, looking like the royalty that they're doing the work for, right? Walrus and carpenter. So the video's an hour long, and if I start talking about the walrus and the carpenter, it's going to be another hour long, and I am getting close to home, and so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. And that's on the most salient point of the entire video. Do not allow anyone to deny you the soul-feeding, professional boosting, secret weapon wielding benefits of muscle memory, of getting better through practice over time, of the assurance of a certain staticness and stability in your tech platforms over time. And that's not going to come from very many sources. Thanks for using your turn signal, person in front of me. Stop short in front of me. I mean, he did slow down, but he just didn't use his turn signal until he realized traffic was backing up behind him. Stupidity. Anyway, you will be able to multitask better. Driving, parallel here is that I can shoot videos like this because car manufacturers are not changing where your steering wheel is, where things on the dashboard are, where your, turn signal and gear shift is. Little bit, if you ever got into Volkswagens and stuff, they certainly try to change it on you. But for the most part, there are standard conventions that work so well that they change very, very little over time. So too is it in certain realms of tech. Not on the web, except maybe vanilla JavaScript, and even then barely, because ECMA script that it's based on keeps changing. They keep adding and borrowing from other languages, and they're pulling the ugly tricks that Perl did. When you kludge enough things together, there's inconsistency in the API, and you have to look up, do you need a space before that parenthesis or curly bracket, or no space? Do you need, double arrow right, greater, so it's a volatile platform. Python, on the other hand, they added one thing called a walrus operator, and it almost tore the community apart. It caused Guido van Rossum to step down as the benevolent dictator for life. It's been a smooth transition, and the world has breathed a sigh of relief because there's great continuity at the Python Foundation, even with the creator of the language stepping down. There's hundreds of billions of dollars, easily, trillions probably, based on Python's reliability, and it cannot be jeopardized at this point. It's grown too large to fail. And so Guido stepping down has not had a negative impact on the platform. However, he did step down on one of these syntax issues, on one of these syntactic sugar, they call it. It can be done in other ways. But what would life be like without with open? If you had to do try else finally in every case, a with open would work. Python would be a much more ugly language, a lot more vertical lines to get what could be a simple, easy expression. So too was it with the walrus operator. I'll get to it in a later video. Walrus operator, walrus and carpenter, and everything ties together ultimately, doesn't it? I'm going to make this guy who's passing me, knowing a lane is disappearing, have to go fast by just going the speed limit. People go around you even though, honestly, they're going to have to go the exact same speed as me because of the traffic lights, but they just want to be that one more car length ahead. I should really not care about it. And there was once a time I was filled with road rage, but I've mellowed out a bit. I've got a little bit of it still, but it's just, the fairness, bug in me. I see that in my daughter all the time. You can't give up your freedom on the altar of fairness. You can't give up your own, capabilities, life choices, and options on the altar of fairness in the moment and in general for people around you. You've got to really, protect your options and, let karma play out. Karma will play out, because if someone's an aggressive driver in one little situation, they're going to be aggressive drivers over and over in lots of situations, and it'll catch up with them. So, where am I going with this? I'm wrapping it up, right? But I'm rambling a little as I wrap it up, because these things are related to each other. I was at the muscle memory of driving. When you can internalize the skills of a trade or a discipline or a tool into your body as if it's an extension of your body, excess capacity is made available for other things. Higher order human thinking. You can think about a lot of other things while you drive, because the automatic muscle memory, it's like you were born knowing how to drive once you've been driving for a while. And it's the perfect example and the cure to modern anxiety, by the way. If you are, a victim of, millennial anxiety syndrome and don't drive because you are a native New Yorker or moved to New York, or for whatever reason, you never took up driving, or you're in the worst still, you're in the burbs where you have to drive and you just never learned, learn to drive. Another thing I did in my life that had a lot of similar effects was to get a big dog that I had to walk every day. It ended up being an unfixed and unneutered dog, which really made you develop your muscle in addition to your muscle memory. But how to keep on alert all the time, looking around you, playing, dozens of alternative futures in your mind that could become reality if not you take this precaution or that. So walking an unneutered, big, powerful dog on a leash twice a day, half hour a day, and taught me to, completely know everything around me, because, one bad, dog eye meeting dog eye, and bam, he pulls. And if you're not holding tight, he could be out of your hand and then putting that dog down for attacking someone. So, walking a big, powerful, unfixed dog twice a day in a neighborhood full of similarly large, unfixed, powerful dogs. Inwood, shout out to Inwood, Manhattan, upstate Manhattan, gave me a lot of muscle memory, a lot of things where, you're on the alert, and there's a lot of unspoken language, a lot of rich, nuanced language that you need to speak as part of your tools. Driving, of course, for obvious reasons, is all the same. And you get one or two of these. Sports is full of this. I hate sports for the most part, but that's because I find real life gives me that satisfaction and that fix on its own. I don't need to go seeking it from other places and become some sort of armchair, something. Don't be an armchair something. Engage. Pick some interests that develop the skills you need to develop. Nat wanted to develop more confidence and upper body strength after some unfortunate zipline incidents. And so she, joined karate, and I put up a pull-up bar, and I'm like, hey, look, you don't really need to do pull-ups on a pull-up bar. Just hang. Just lift your legs off the ground and hang. That's going to give you a lot. There's so much body confidence, body awareness, muscle memory that develops from such easy stuff. And so that's a real good place to start. You want to start developing better skills that'll last you for life? Start easy. Learn how to open a terminal. And it's not a Windows COM window. That's not a terminal. It's not a PowerShell window. It's not a Windows PowerShell window. That's not a terminal. A terminal is what you get when you install Linux on Windows, which is a cinch to do now because you can get it from the Microsoft Store. Go to the Microsoft Store, search on Ubuntu. Install Ubuntu onto your Windows machine. You're not doing it for Ubuntu, you're doing it for the Windows terminal. In fact, you don't even need Ubuntu. You could just search on Windows terminal and you would get the Windows terminal. However, in one of the terminal tabs, you want a Unix/Linux actual terminal. You want the CDs and the LSs and the other command lines and the whole operating system of Linux. That's why really getting Ubuntu is better to get from the store than just the Linux terminal. And best is both, so that you don't have to boot into Ubuntu to get the terminal. You can get the terminal whenever you want and use it for the COM window or PowerShell, but most importantly, use it for Ubuntu, which under Windows right now mostly means the terminal, right? It was a big deal where they were like, oh, you can get Linux under Windows, but it's not the graphics version. That's bad for most people, but for me, that's like, oh, that's exactly what I want. You don't want the graphics version. It's just overhead and confusing, having two desktops on your desktop. Who needs it? You install Ubuntu to get a Linux terminal, and then you're using a Linux terminal. On Macs, it's much easier. You just go to Spotlight and start typing terminal. There might be a keyboard shortcut for it. I try and put it always on something T for terminal. I leave shortcuts out on my desktop on Windows and use Control-Alt-T, and that's my standard convention. There's a little bit of keyboard shortcut muscle memory. I would have to rewire from platform to platform, but it's very minor. It's a small adjustment. Once you get into your terminal, then everything is the same. Or you get into your other software that you've committed to muscle memory, like a web browser, for example, right? Everything is the same, creating new tabs and popping around through between your address bar and the lower area. Learn those shortcuts even in the web browser. It's really worth it, especially switching between tabs. And a keyboard shortcut to launch software. Inside software, you have the advantage of stable tools over time. Develop your muscle memory, get better and better at things, and start getting the benefit of like martial arts and musicians and sports people, athletes who have a relationship with their equipment, a relationship that starts early and lasts long. I'm 50 and I'm only still just settling into many of these tools that I realize now I should have considered fundamental from about the age of 12. There's no reason you can't be taking up Linux, Python, Vim, and Git in the way I use them from about the age of 12 or so. Before that, you probably don't have the patience to launch a Vim and start playing it like a video game, but there's where I'll stop, you know? Open a Linux terminal on whatever platform you're on, type Vim to get into the Vim text editor, and then figure out how to get out of it, and that's where I'll pick up on the next video. Okay, spoiler. It's the escape key to clear anything you might have done, and then :Q. The colon key, the two dots on top of each other, you type that, and Q for quit. And the colon puts you in command mode, and Q is the command to quit. If you've actually typed anything and you need to save first, you could do :WQ for write your changes and then quit, because it won't let you quit if you've made any changes. Alternatively, you could do :Q exclamation point, which forces a quit. And that's where I'll stop. Muscle memory begins there. Text editor for lifetime, one macro record and play back, you know, one configuration file that travels with you forever, and truly a text editor that plays with a video, like a video game, to the point where it's almost like telepathic control and you get all those secret weapons things I talk about. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon. And don't forget to figure out how to open a Linux terminal window and subscribe.